At first, I hardly even noticed it, a brief, passing moment that should have slipped by without a second thought, but it didn't. It stayed with me, lingering in the back of my mind. It was a Wednesday evening, one of those calm, uneventful nights that filled the gaps between busier days. I was sprawled on the couch, flipping through channels without actually watching anything, while Jessica stood in the kitchen, her eyes glued to her phone. She let out a quiet laugh, almost to herself. I glanced over, thinking it was just one of those casual moments, probably something funny she'd come across online. But then, I noticed her hand shift slightly, her thumb hovering over the screen with a kind of hesitation I wasn't used to seeing from her. She locked the phone and slid it into her pocket, still smiling but saying nothing. A small chill crawled up my spine, subtle, but it was there. It wasn't her laugh that unsettled me, it was the way she'd hidden it. Normally, she'd share little things like that with me, a funny meme, a joke, something from her work chat. We used to share everything. I told myself to let it go. I really tried. But that moment clung to me, gnawing at my thoughts like a splinter you can't quite get rid of. The days blurred by in the usual routine, work, dinner, a few quiet chats over a glass of wine, but something felt off. That unease wouldn't leave. Every time her phone buzzed, my eyes would dart over, just to see if she'd tuck it away again. Sometimes she didn't. Sometimes she'd answer right in front of me, chat for a minute, and carry on like nothing happened. But there were other times, moments where there was this pause, this flicker of tension when her phone lit up and she turned away, scrolling through messages in silence. At first, I didn't think I was being paranoid, just a feeling, like an itch I couldn't reach. I kept telling myself I was overthinking, letting tiny details get to me. But late at night, when Jessica would say she was exhausted from another long day at work, I'd lie there in bed, staring at the ceiling, replaying every small moment in my head. Her late nights had become more frequent in the last few months, more work dinners, more spontaneous meetings. I had never really questioned it before. I should have. One evening, after yet another one of those long days, Jessica walked through the door smelling like wine, not unusual, something I usually associated with her office parties or a glass or two with colleagues, but this time, it felt different. She was quieter, distant. I asked her about her day, about her evening, just like I always did. Her answers were short, almost rehearsed, like her mind was somewhere else. When I brought up Brian, her boss, I saw her tense up. Brian? What about him? She shot back, a little too quickly, as if she had been waiting for the question but hadn't thought about how to answer it. I played it off, pretending I didn't catch the change in her voice, but inside, it only made my suspicions grow. Brian had always been a bit of a shadow in our marriage, charming, successful, a guy who seemed to get whatever he wanted. I met him once at one of her company events. His handshake was too firm, his smile a little too wide, like he owned the entire room, including her. I didn't like the way he looked at Jessica that night, but I convinced myself I was being overly sensitive, that it was just my own insecurity talking. Now, though, I wasn't so sure. The more I thought about it, the more the little things started adding up, the late nights, the unexplained calls, the growing distance between us, the sound of her laughter when I wasn't around. What once seemed like random coincidences were beginning to look more like a pattern. And then there was her phone, always close by, but never left out in the open. She had become more protective of it, more careful, as if it held something I wasn't meant to see. One Saturday morning, she left early for her usual yoga class. The moment I heard the front door close behind her, I sat up in bed, my heart racing. Her phone was still on the nightstand. She'd forgotten it. It was the first time in weeks she hadn't taken it with her. The logical part of me shouted to leave it alone, to not give in. But the restless part of me, the part that had been lying awake every night, replaying all the times she'd turned away from me, won out. I picked up the phone, feeling like a man teetering on the edge of a cliff, ready to plunge into the unknown. Unlocking it was easy, I knew her password. We used to share everything. Or at least, I thought we had. As I swiped through her messages, a wave of nausea hit me, like I was crossing some invisible line. But I couldn't stop myself. I scrolled through chats with her friends, her colleagues. Everything seemed ordinary, mundane even. For a second, I wondered if I had been wrong, if I'd imagined it all, creating a betrayal where none existed. And then, I saw it. Tucked away under work-related conversations, nearly hidden, was a name that froze me in my tracks. Brian. At first, the messages seemed harmless, quick notes about meetings and deadlines. But the deeper I scrolled, the tone began to change. Subtle jokes, inside comments, and then a shift, blurred lines between work and something more personal. I read each message again, my anger and disbelief blurring my vision. My hand hovered over the phone, tempted to throw it across the room, but I couldn't move, frozen by the harsh reality staring back at me. I can't wait to see you tonight. Last night was incredible. I can still feel you. I dropped the phone. It slipped from my grasp as though it had scorched my skin. My body felt like dead weight, sinking into the bed. My heart thundered in my chest, each beat hammering away at my skull. I wanted to scream, to rage, to confront her immediately, but I couldn't. Not yet. My mind raced back through every interaction we'd had in recent months, the distance, the excuses, the late nights. Suddenly, it all made sense. Every piece of the puzzle fit perfectly, and I realized just how long this had been happening. I couldn't believe how blind I had been. But instead of fury, I felt something cold and clear, the kind of clarity that settles in when you've crossed the point of no return. I knew what had to come next. When Jessica came home that afternoon, I didn't bring it up. No confrontation. No questions. I simply watched her closely as she moved around the house, her smile now a facade, her words hollow. She kissed me on the cheek, and I let her, but something had shifted. She didn't realize it yet, but everything was different now. The trust we once had was gone, shattered like the glass from a broken window, though she wouldn't notice the fragments until it was far too late. The worst part wasn't even the fact that she had cheated. It wasn't the lies. It was the realization that I had let it all happen, that I had ignored every warning sign for so long. I had been passive, oblivious. But not anymore. I wasn't going to confront her, not yet. I wasn't going to yell or throw accusations. No, I was going to wait. I would let her believe she'd gotten away with it. And when she least expected it, I would dismantle her world, piece by piece. Because Brian wasn't the only one who knew how to play games, and now I understood the rules. After that day, I started observing Jessica differently. Every conversation, every move she made became something to dissect, something to study. I didn't ask her direct questions. I didn't tip my hand. Instead, I listened more carefully than ever, paying attention to the subtle changes in her voice, her body language. There were cracks forming, small hesitations when I'd ask about her day. She offered fewer details, retreating into vague excuses about meetings or drinks with coworkers. She used to tell me everything. Now, it felt like I was an outsider, like I was someone she needed to hide from. She had no idea I was already watching her every move. We still spent our evenings together, sitting on the couch like we always had, but something unspoken had shifted between us. The room felt quieter, colder. Whenever her phone buzzed on the coffee table, she'd grab it quickly, give the screen a quick glance, and then turn it face down. My gaze would linger on her, waiting for her to explain who it was. But she didn't. Not anymore. What used to be intimate between us had been replaced with an ever-growing distance, and I could feel it creeping in more with each passing day. I made sure not to let on that anything had changed for me. I didn't want her to suspect a thing. I kept my voice steady and casual, even though every excuse, every word that came out of her mouth, fueled my anger a little more. Sometimes, I'd catch her looking at me like she could sense the tension, but then she'd flash that same smile, the one that was starting to feel like a mask. We were living in a house of lies, but I wasn't about to let her see that I had already spotted the cracks. It was one of those evenings when everything really began to unravel. Jessica had another late-night meeting at work. "Brian's been pushing us hard on this new project," she said during dinner, her eyes avoiding mine. Her fork scraped against her plate, her movements more jittery than usual. "We might be stuck late tonight." I nodded, offering her the same empty response I'd been perfecting over the past few weeks. "Don't wear yourself out," I replied, my voice flat, emotionless. Inside, though, I was already piecing together the next steps, gearing up for what would come next. As soon as she left, I made my move. Her laptop was in the home office, sitting there locked but open. I had never snooped into her work life before, but this wasn't about trust anymore. This was a war, and I needed every tool I could find. I used the same password I knew from her phone. It hadn't changed in years, but I'd never needed to use it until now. The screen unlocked, revealing a sea of emails, work documents, and calendar invites. For a few minutes, I thought I might not find anything. Everything looked ordinary, professional. But then I came across an attachment in a meeting invite from Brian. The subject line was harmless enough, project update, but it was the body of the email that grabbed my attention. It wasn't filled with the usual corporate talk I expected. Instead, it was short, personal. "Can't wait to see you after. Let's finish what we started." My jaw tightened. I continued scrolling through the rest of her inbox, and there it was, more of the same. Little coded messages tucked between spreadsheets and business notes, sneaky remarks Brian had slipped in, thinking no one would notice. But I noticed. The emails weren't incriminating enough to expose their affair on their own, nothing that would blow the lid off the whole thing, but I knew there was more. It was only a matter of time before I uncovered it all. That night, when Jessica came home, she smelled like a fancy perfume, the kind she didn't own. She kissed me on the cheek like always, but her lips lingered a second longer than usual, almost like she was trying to make up for the lie she was living. "How was your night?" she asked, kicking off her heels and falling into her routine, her back turned to me. "Quiet," I answered, keeping my voice calm. But inside, I was seething. I watched her head upstairs, her figure disappearing into the dark hallway. Every instinct screamed at me to follow her, to confront her, to shout and demand answers for everything she had done. But that would have been too easy. Too soon. I had a bigger plan in mind, and I wasn't about to let my emotions ruin it. Not now. Not when I was so close to finding out everything. The tension between us only worsened in the days that followed. Jessica became more distant, more evasive. I caught her sneaking looks at her phone during dinner, her replies growing shorter and more cryptic. I could feel her slipping further away, vanishing into a world I no longer had access to, a world that Brian was now part of. I didn't push her. Instead, I let her dig her own grave, one text at a time. Every night, after she fell asleep, I'd check her phone, her laptop, uncovering more of the truth. It felt like a slow drip of poison, watching our marriage unravel piece by piece. But the deeper I dug, the clearer it became, this wasn't just an affair. Brian had grown bolder with his emails. He'd begun sending her personal notes, inviting her to private meetings that had nothing to do with work. He was flaunting their relationship, convinced no one would ever find out, certain that I was too blind, too trusting to see it. Well, I wasn't blind anymore. One night, as I sifted through Jessica's phone, I came across a message that made my blood turn to ice. It wasn't the usual flirtatious back and forth with Brian. This time, it was confirmation of everything I had feared. "We'll meet at my place tomorrow night. You know I can't get enough of you. Same time." I stared at the screen, my grip tightening around the phone. There it was, the undeniable proof. She wasn't just lying to me anymore. She was actively betraying me, sneaking off to be with him while I sat at home, swallowing her excuses about work and deadlines. I sat in the dark, the glow from the phone casting sharp shadows across my face. The fury I'd been holding back for weeks was ready to explode, but I forced myself to stay calm. I knew this was coming. I'd been preparing for it. Now that I had what I needed, it was time to act. The next morning, I confronted her, but not in the way she would have expected. I didn't come at her with accusations. I wanted to watch her squirm, to see just how much more she could lie. Over breakfast, I casually asked, "You've been working late a lot lately. Everything okay at the office?" She barely glanced up from her coffee. "Yeah, it's fine. You know how Brian is, he's such a perfectionist." I forced a smile, making it seem natural. "He seems to take up a lot of your time. Maybe I should have a chat with him." For a split second, I saw a panic flash in her eyes, but she quickly recovered, shaking her head. "No, it's okay. Just a few more weeks of this, and things will settle down." Her lies tasted bitter, even from where I sat. I nodded like I believed her. But inside, I was already working on the next phase of my plan. She didn't know it yet, but I was about to destroy everything they thought they had. That evening, while Jessica was in the shower, I made a call. It was to Megan, Brian's wife. We hadn't spoken in a long time, but I knew enough about her to know she wasn't the type to ignore what was going on right under her nose. Brian had underestimated her, just like he'd underestimated me. "Megan," I said when she picked up, "I think we need to have a talk." There was silence on the other end for a few seconds, then I heard her sigh, quiet but steady. "I've been waiting for this," she said, her voice calm but resigned. I knew it was only a matter of time. We arranged to meet the next day. No need for long explanations. She already knew. She'd been watching Brian just as closely as I'd been watching Jessica. Now, we were in this together, two people betrayed by the ones we trusted most. And together, we were going to bring them down. My meeting with Megan didn't take long, but it was powerful. We didn't have to say much. The anger in her eyes mirrored my own, and we both understood what needed to be done. Brian and Jessica thought they had played me for a fool, but they had no idea what I was capable of when pushed to the edge. By the time I left Megan's house, I had the final pieces of my plan set in motion. Everything was ready for Brian's company event, the night where he and Jessica would be flaunting their relationship for everyone to see, believing they were untouchable. They had no clue what was about to hit them. When Jessica came home that night, I kissed her like always, my lips grazing hers with the same practiced affection I'd shown for years. But this time, love wasn't what fueled me, it was the knowledge that in just a few days, their world was going to crumble, and I'd be the one striking the match to set it all ablaze. After leaving Megan's house, my mind was humming with a cold, ruthless clarity. The betrayal had burned through every part of me, but now the fire had died down, leaving only ashes and an intense focus. It was time to turn the chaos Jessica and Brian had created into something far more destructive, something that would take their lives apart piece by piece. That evening, I pulled back, retreating into our bedroom under the guise of being exhausted. Jessica didn't even ask about it, she hadn't shown much interest in me for weeks, too absorbed in her own little world to notice the growing chasm between us. I sat alone in the darkness, the silence amplifying the thudding in my head as I sifted through old memories, replaying them one by one, the laughter, the late nights, the excuses that had once seemed so reasonable. I wasn't that naive anymore. As I lay in bed, one thought kept circling in my mind: when had it all changed? When had I stopped being her husband and become someone to lie to, someone to cast aside? Was there a specific moment, a conversation, when she decided I wasn't enough, or had it crept in slowly, like rust eating away at metal until it was too late to stop the decay? I wasn't angry anymore, not in that explosive way I'd been when I first saw the messages. Now, all I felt was this cold, simmering calculation. Jessica had made her choices, and so had Brian. They thought they were untouchable, hiding behind work dinners and secret texts, but they didn't know I was about to unravel every thread of the life they thought they'd built in the shadows. But I couldn't confront her. Not yet. I had to wait. I needed more information, more leverage. I had to dig into every corner of Brian's life before I made my move. I wasn't about to let them see how much their betrayal had gutted me. I was done playing the victim. The next morning, I started my search. Brian was successful, powerful, at least on the surface. But no one rises that fast without leaving some dirt behind, and I was determined to find it. I spent hours at my laptop, poring over public records, financial reports, and news clippings. His public image was spotless, sure, but I wasn't looking for what was out in the open. I was hunting for the cracks. It didn't take long to find them, small inconsistencies in his business dealings at first, but they grew bigger with each contract his company signed. Shady partnerships, off-the-books expenses, it was all there, hidden in plain sight for anyone who knew where to look. I'd seen it before in my own work, men who thought they could outsmart the system, who believed they were above the rules. They always left something behind. Brian was no exception. As the hours passed, the pieces started falling into place. Brian wasn't just a cheater, he was a fraud, laundering money through his company, using his connections to line his own pockets. It was only a matter of time before the authorities caught up with him, and I was going to make sure that time came sooner rather than later. The company event, the one Brian had been bragging about to Jessica, was the perfect stage. It was their annual gala, the night where Brian showed off his success to investors, clients, and all the industry big shots. Everyone who mattered would be there, watching him parade around like a king, with Jessica at his side, his ego bigger than ever. But this time, the spotlight wasn't going to shine on his success. It was going to be on the handcuffs locking around his wrists. I didn't need to destroy him completely. I just had to show everyone exactly who he really was. The next day, when I met Megan, she was more than ready. We sat across from each other in a small cafe, our voices low, eyes locked in mutual understanding. She had her own reasons for wanting Brian to fall, reasons she didn't even need to spell out. We were both here because we had been betrayed, and this wasn't about finding closure. It was about control, about making them feel as powerless as we had. "I've got everything," I said, sliding a file across the table. "Financial discrepancies. More than enough to trigger an investigation." Her eyes scanned the papers briefly. She didn't ask how I got them. "You're sure this'll work?" I nodded. "He's been careful, but not careful enough. The money trail is messy. If anyone digs deep enough, it'll raise red flags. And with the right nudge, the authorities won't have a choice but to look into it." She nodded, her jaw set with resolve. "And Jessica?" "I'm not worried about her," I said, leaning back, feeling the cold satisfaction wash over me. "She'll just be collateral damage. When Brian falls, she'll lose everything." For the next hour, we fine-tuned every detail of the plan, going over each step with precision. Megan had contacts at the local police precinct, people who could make sure Brian's arrest happened right at the event, where it would be as public and humiliating as possible. Everything Brian had built was going to come crashing down, and Jessica would be left standing in the ruins. I left that meeting feeling lighter, as if the weight of their betrayal had shifted. It wasn't gone, not by a long shot, but now it felt manageable. Now I was the one in control. Over the following days, I watched Jessica glide through our house, completely unaware of the storm I was about to unleash. She still kissed me before heading off to work, still smiled like nothing had changed. But I could see it clearly now, the growing space between us, the hollow void where trust used to be. Every time she walked out the door, I pictured her heading to Brian's place, slipping into his bed, feeding him the same lies she'd fed me. But I kept my cool. I didn't let her see the rage that simmered just beneath the surface. I played my part as the clueless, trusting husband, letting her think she'd won, allowing her to believe she was safe. It was almost laughable, watching her lie to me so effortlessly, never realizing I'd already outplayed her. The day of the event arrived faster than I expected. Jessica was buzzing with excitement, her energy contagious as she spent the afternoon getting ready. She spun around in front of the mirror, asking me how she looked in her new dress, her eyes glowing with anticipation. "You look beautiful," I told her, the words cutting like glass in my throat. It would be the last time I'd say them. Brian's gala was held at one of the most prestigious hotels in the city, the kind of place where success was showcased and reputations were built. The ballroom sparkled with chandeliers, and everywhere you looked, there were people dressed to impress. This was Brian's night to shine, and he was in his element. I could see it in the way he moved through the crowd, shaking hands, laughing a little too loudly, his arm never straying far from Jessica's waist. I hung back, keeping my distance, watching them act like a couple completely at ease in their deceit. I wondered if Jessica even thought about me that night, if it crossed her mind that I was standing there, watching them together. But in the end, it didn't matter. By the time the night was over, they wouldn't have much to smile about. As the evening wore on, I felt a shift in the atmosphere, a subtle change in the room's energy. I caught Megan's eye from across the crowd, and she gave me a small nod. The moment had come. Everything was in motion now, and all that was left was to sit back and watch it unfold. The first sign that something was off came when two men in dark suits walked into the ballroom, their faces set in stone, scanning the crowd with purpose. Without hesitation, they made their way directly toward Brian, who was in the middle of chatting with one of his investors. I watched as realization slowly dawned on him, his smile faltered, and his grip on Jessica's arm tightened just a little too hard. "Brian Adams," one of the men said, flashing a badge. "You're under arrest for financial fraud and embezzlement." The entire room fell into a dead silence. Jessica's face froze, her eyes wide with shock as Brian was cuffed right there in front of everyone. His confident facade shattered, replaced by confusion and panic. He stammered, trying to explain, but the officers weren't interested in his excuses. They pulled him out of the ballroom, leaving a trail of stunned silence behind them. Jessica was left standing there, alone and exposed under the harsh lights. The life she had so carefully built with Brian, the one she'd risked everything for, was crumbling in front of her, and there wasn't a single thing she could do to stop it. I stayed back, watching her, waiting for the moment she'd turn and look at me, to finally realize the truth. But she didn't. She couldn't. She was too busy watching her world go up in flames, and I was the one who had ignited it. The ballroom buzzed with murmurs as Brian was led out in handcuffs, his once powerful presence now reduced to a stumbling mess, desperately trying to comprehend what had just happened. His eyes darted around the room, searching for someone, anyone, to step in and save him, but no one moved. The same investors, colleagues, and so-called friends who had been drawn to him moments before now turned their backs, as if afraid his downfall might rub off on them. Jessica stood there, paralyzed, her face a mask of disbelief. She didn't chase after him. She didn't call his name. It was like watching a slow-motion wreck, her life crashing headlong into the consequences of her choices. Her eyes scanned the room, searching for something to hold on to, something that made sense amidst the chaos. But all she found was the widening distance between us. I stayed where I was, relishing the cold satisfaction that swelled inside me. This was the moment I'd been waiting for, the moment her perfect little lie came undone. Around us, people whispered, exchanging glances, their hushed voices barely audible over the buzz of the ballroom. Brian's reputation was shattered beyond repair. And Jessica? She was the collateral damage I had warned Megan about. The glittering facade of her life had cracked wide open, exposing the mess beneath. At last, Jessica's eyes landed on me. Her face twisted in confusion, as if part of her mind was still struggling to understand how this could have happened. She took a hesitant step toward me, her lips parting like she wanted to speak, but no words came out. I didn't move. I wanted her to feel it, the slow, dawning realization that I had been the one pulling the strings all along. Then, with deliberate calm, I broke eye contact and turned away from her, as if she didn't exist. That small act of dismissal, turning my back on her, walking away, was more satisfying than any heated confrontation could have been. She had expected anger, a fight, maybe even a desperate plea for answers. But all I gave her was cold, unyielding indifference. I left her to unravel on her own. I didn't need to lift a finger. As I made my way toward the exit, Megan caught up with me, her expression calm, though I could see the satisfaction simmering just beneath her composed demeanor. "You did it," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "We did it," I corrected her. This wasn't just about my revenge. Brian had deceived her, played her for a fool, just like Jessica had done to me. Together, we had orchestrated the perfect takedown. And now it was over. Outside, the night was cool and still, a stark contrast to the storm of chaos we had just left behind. I took a deep breath, trying to shake off the remnants of the night's tension. Megan stood beside me, her arms crossed as she gazed up at the quiet sky. "How do you feel?" Megan asked after a long stretch of silence. I didn't answer right away. The truth was, I wasn't sure how I felt. Satisfaction, yes, relief, absolutely, but there was something else nagging at the edges of my mind. It wasn't guilt. I didn't regret what I had done. Brian and Jessica had earned everything that had come their way. But as the adrenaline began to drain away, I realized that the hollow emptiness I'd felt before hadn't vanished, it had only shifted. "I feel free," I said, though the words felt strange as they left my mouth. It wasn't quite freedom, but it was something close to it. Megan didn't respond, but I could tell she understood. We stood there for a while longer, letting the weight of the night settle over us, before parting ways without another word. The days that followed played out like watching a slow-motion wreck. Brian's arrest hit the news, his company spiraled into chaos, and the fallout was swift and brutal. Investors backed out, clients pulled away, and the empire he'd built crumbled at his feet. It was everything I had envisioned. His fall from grace was inevitable now, and there was no escaping it. But Jessica, she was a different story. After that night, she withdrew into herself, barely speaking, barely eating. She didn't try to explain, didn't attempt to justify her actions. Maybe she knew it was pointless. There was no redemption, no words that could undo what had happened. The weight of her choices had crushed her, and I could see it in every movement, in the way she avoided my eyes as if meeting my gaze would hurt too much. I didn't gloat. I didn't need to. She was punishing herself, sinking deeper into the hell she'd created, and a part of me found satisfaction in that, the quiet, twisted comfort of knowing she had destroyed her own life. But another part of me began to wonder, what now? The revenge had been executed perfectly, the plan flawless. I had won, yet there was no joy in it, no final triumphant moment, only the slow, gnawing emptiness that had been there all along. Megan and I stayed in touch. Our bond deepened over the shared experience of betrayal. It wasn't romantic, at least, not yet, but there was an unspoken connection between us, something that only two people who had endured the same kind of pain could understand. We met for coffee, talked about what life might look like after all of this, and in those conversations, I found a sense of solace. She was the only one who truly understood what it felt like to burn everything down for the sake of revenge. One evening, as we sat across from each other in a quiet cafe, Megan leaned in, her expression thoughtful. "Do you ever wonder if it was worth it?" Her question hung in the air, and for a moment, I didn't know how to respond. Was it worth it? I had asked myself that same thing in the quiet moments when the rush of victory faded. Had bringing down Brian and Jessica really given me what I wanted, or had it only left me with more questions? "I don't know," I said softly. I thought it would feel different, like it would fix everything. But now, But now it's just you, she finished for me. I nodded. That was the truth of it. I had poured everything into the revenge, into taking back control, but I hadn't thought much about what would come after. Now, as the dust settled, I was left standing in the wreckage, unsure of where to go from here. Megan gave me a small, knowing smile. It's the aftermath. It's always harder than the plan itself. She was right. The plan had been easy, calculated, precise, but the emotional fallout, the hollow feeling that lingered even after I'd gotten what I thought I wanted, that was something else entirely. It was a different kind of battle, one I wasn't sure I was prepared to fight. We left the cafe that night with a quiet understanding between us. Both of us had been broken in different ways by the people we had once loved and trusted, and while revenge had given us a fleeting sense of power, it hadn't mended the wounds. Not really. At home, Jessica's silence continued to stretch between us. She kept her distance, more like a ghost drifting through the house than a living, breathing person. We were still technically married, though that word felt empty now, stripped of any real meaning. Neither of us had filed for divorce, and I think that was because doing so would make it all final, irrevocable. Maybe neither of us knew how to take that next step. One night, I found her sitting alone at the dining table, her face buried in her hands. I didn't need to ask what was wrong. I already knew. She had lost everything, Brian, her career, her reputation, and now, all that remained was this house and the memories we had built in it. Memories that were now tainted beyond repair by her betrayal. She didn't look up when I entered the room. For a brief moment, I thought about saying something, offering her some semblance of closure, but what would it matter? We were beyond apologies, beyond explanations. This was the end, and we both understood that. Without a word, I turned and walked away, leaving her in the darkness she had created for herself. As I lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, it hit me that the real challenge wasn't over yet. The revenge had gone off without a hitch, but now came the hard part, figuring out what came next. The satisfaction of seeing them fall hadn't filled the void I thought it would. It hadn't brought me the peace I was looking for. As I drifted into a restless sleep, I wondered if it ever would. The days after Brian's arrest were a blur, headlines, phone calls, and the inevitable fallout. His empire collapsed faster than I had expected. Everything he had built crumbled under the weight of his scandal, and the same people who had once clung to his every word were now doing everything they could to distance themselves. There would be no redemption for Brian, he was heading to prison, and he knew it. As for Jessica, she became a shadow in our home, a lingering presence in the empty spaces we once shared. I didn't ask her where she went when she left, and she didn't offer any explanations. The silence between us had grown so vast it was almost a relief. I thought that would be enough to keep us apart for good, but that illusion shattered the night she finally spoke. It was late. The house was quiet except for the soft hum of the refrigerator. I was at the dining table, scrolling through updates on Brian's case, when I heard her footsteps. I didn't bother to look up. I hadn't in days. The air between us was thick with everything we hadn't said. Matthew, her voice broke the silence, raw and fragile. I looked up, but stayed silent. Our eyes met, and I could see how broken she was, her eyes red and swollen, her face gaunt. Jessica had always been composed, always in control, but now she looked like she was barely holding it together. She sat across from me, her hands shaking as she tried to steady them. I don't know what to say. I know what I've done. I know how much I've hurt you. Her voice was soft, almost a whisper, but there was desperation in it, the kind that only surfaces when there's nothing left to lose. I kept my expression cold, distant. It was the same mask I had worn ever since I found out about her and Brian. You don't have to say anything. Her lips quivered, struggling to form words. I was wrong, Matthew. I was so wrong. I don't expect you to forgive me, but please, I just need you to understand. Brian, I cut her off, my voice sharp, controlled. Brian was a mistake. Is that what you're about to say? That he was just some momentary lapse in judgment? That it wasn't as bad as I think? Her eyes welled with tears, but I felt nothing. I had heard enough lies to last a lifetime. It wasn't just a mistake, Jessica. You chose this. Every text, every secret meeting, every lie, you made those choices. You didn't care what it would do to me. You didn't care what it would do to us. She reached out, as if to touch my hand, but I pulled back before her fingers could make contact. The motion stopped her in her tracks, and for a moment, her whole facade crumbled. It looked like the weight of it all might finally crush her. I was lost, she whispered, her voice barely holding together. I didn't know what I was doing. I wasn't happy. But it wasn't your fault. You didn't do anything wrong. It was me. I leaned back in my chair, letting her confession sink in. Her words felt empty, hollow attempts to rationalize the months of betrayal, as though her unhappiness somehow excused everything she had done. I've heard enough. You weren't happy, I repeated, my voice calm but frigid. And sleeping with your boss was your solution. She flinched at the sharpness of my words, but I wasn't about to stop. Brian didn't fix anything for you, Jessica. He was just your way out, an escape so you didn't have to deal with whatever was wrong between us. But you didn't just run away, you destroyed everything. Her tears started falling freely now, and she didn't even try to wipe them away. I know, she choked out, barely able to speak. I know I ruined everything. I've lost it all. I don't know how to make it right. I shook my head, bitterness rising within me. You can't. There's no going back. You can't undo what you did. You and Brian thought you could have it all, your affair, your lies, your little secret, but look where that got you. Her sobs filled the space between us, and for a brief moment, I felt a flicker of something, pity, maybe, but it wasn't enough to change anything. I had spent too much time simmering in my anger, too much time planning for this moment to let her tears move me now. I don't want your forgiveness, she said finally, her voice cracking under the weight of her sobs. I just need you to know, I loved you. I still do. Her words hung in the air like a bitter poison, seeping into the cracks of my resolve. But it was too late. Whatever love had existed between us had been buried the moment she chose Brian over us. You loved me? I repeated, shaking my head in disbelief. No, Jessica. You loved the idea of me. You loved what our life looked like on the outside. But real love doesn't betray. It doesn't lie. What you had with Brian wasn't love. It was selfish. She collapsed into her sobs, her whole body trembling with the force of it, but I remained unmoved. This was what she had become, someone who had set her own life on fire and was now begging for the ashes. I stood up, the chair scraping across the floor as I pushed it back. You want me to understand, but you never once stopped to understand what your actions did to me, Jessica. You were so wrapped up in your own misery that you never even cared about the damage you were causing. She looked up at me, her face streaked with tears, her eyes filled with desperation. Matthew, please. I don't know what to do. I have nothing left. For a moment, I considered walking out of the room, leaving her to sit in the wreckage of her choices. But something stopped me. Maybe it was the hollow feeling that had settled in after Brian's downfall. Maybe it was the need to bring this all to a close, once and for all. I leaned over the table, locking eyes with her, my voice low and steady. You're right, Jessica. You have nothing left. And you know what? That's not my problem anymore. I straightened up, watching as my words hit her like a wave. The realization was sinking in. I was done. There would be no redemption, no second chances, no way to salvage what was left. We were finished, and she needed to understand that. Goodbye, Jessica, I said, letting the finality of the words hang between us. I walked out without looking back, her sobs echoing down the hall as I moved away. I didn't stop. I couldn't. She had made her decision, and now I had made mine. At the front door, I hesitated for a brief moment, glancing back toward the darkened house. This had been my home for years, our home. Now it felt foreign, like it belonged to someone else. There was nothing left for me here, nothing that connected me to the person I once was. I took a deep breath and stepped outside, the cool night air hitting my skin like a jolt. The weight of everything, the betrayal, the revenge, seemed to lift, even if just for a fleeting moment. I had gotten what I wanted, but victory tasted far more bitter than I expected. I stood there for a while, staring up at the stars, wondering what came next. The final confrontation was over, but the real battle, the one inside me, still raged. I had destroyed the life we had built together, and now I stood in the ruins. But as the night stretched on, I realized something: I wasn't going to rebuild. I was going to leave it all behind, just like I had left Jessica. There was no going back. And for the first time in a long while, I felt ready for that. The days after I left the house were quieter than I imagined they'd be, no dramatic scenes, no tidal wave of emotions, just silence. Jessica's sobs still echoed faintly in the back of my mind, but they had become distant, like the fading notes of a song that had ended long ago. I moved into a small apartment downtown, a place where no one knew who I was, and anonymity felt like a relief. I needed space, distance from the wreckage of the life I had burned to the ground. Revenge had been everything I had planned for, but now that it was over, there was nothing left to hold on to. For weeks, the headlines continued to roll in, each one more damning than the last. Brian's face was plastered all over the news, his empire in ruins, his assets frozen, and his future behind bars all but certain. It was exactly what I'd orchestrated, exactly the outcome I had envisioned. I should have felt satisfied, maybe even triumphant. But sitting alone in that cramped apartment, with only the city's distant hum outside my window, I realized the emptiness inside me hadn't gone anywhere. Work became my distraction. The long hours kept my mind occupied, kept the memories from creeping in too much. But late at night, when the city lights flickered outside, the thoughts would swirl. I had gotten my revenge, torn their lives apart as thoroughly as they had shattered mine. But what had it really changed? Megan called me one evening, a few weeks after everything had settled. Her voice was calm, but I could hear the same weariness in her tone that I felt deep in my bones. "How are you holding up?" she asked, her words tentative. "I'm fine," I replied, though we both knew that wasn't the truth. "And you?" "Surviving," she said with a small sigh. "It's strange, the silence, isn't it? After everything, I thought it would feel like freedom. But instead, it just feels like nothing." I nodded, even though she couldn't see me. We were in the same place, stuck in the aftermath of our own destruction. "Yeah, I get that," I said quietly. There was a pause, a heavy silence that we both let sit for a while. Then she spoke again. "I've been thinking, maybe we should meet up. Talk. See if there's anything left after all this." It wasn't surprising. We had been orbiting each other ever since the day Brian was taken away in handcuffs. Megan and I were tied together now, not by love, but by shared scars. And maybe, for now, that was enough. We met at the same small cafe, the one where we had first laid the plans for Brian's downfall. The cafe itself hadn't changed, but we had. We sat across from each other, sipping our coffee in the quiet, our conversation easy but tinged with the weight of everything we had done. Megan looked better than the last time I had seen her, less weighed down by the past, though I could still see the cracks beneath her calm demeanor. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked, her eyes searching mine for some kind of answer. I let the question linger for a moment, turning it over in my mind. "No," I said finally. "I don't regret what we did. Brian and Jessica, they had it coming. But sometimes, I do wonder if it was really worth it. Megan nodded, her gaze dropping to the cup in her hands. Yeah, me too. We sat there in silence, watching the world outside move along as if nothing had happened. Life kept going, even after everything we had destroyed. People still walked by, still sipped their coffee, still went about their lives, oblivious to the wreckage we had left in our wake. It felt strange, watching the world continue to spin while we were stuck standing in the aftermath of what we had torn down. I'm not sure what comes next, she said softly, her voice almost uncertain. I thought once Brian was out of the picture, I'd feel free. But now that he's gone, I don't know what I'm supposed to do. I guess we just keep moving forward, I replied, though the words felt hollow. Moving forward sounded simple, but it was anything but. Still, it was the only option left. She gave a faint smile, a shadow of what a real one used to be, barely reaching her eyes. Yeah, maybe that's all we can do. After that, Megan and I began spending more time together, not in the frantic, intense way of people diving into something new, but in a quiet, steady way. Our companionship grew from the ashes of our shared pain. We were two people who had been broken by the same betrayal, and while we didn't have all the answers, we found comfort in each other's company. It wasn't love, not yet, but it was a kind of understanding, and for now, that was enough. The divorce papers came a few weeks later. Jessica didn't fight it. There were no calls, no further explanations. She had vanished from my life as completely as Brian had. Signing those papers felt less like the end of a marriage and more like closing a chapter that had already finished long before I'd even realized. I had once believed that revenge would heal the wound, that watching Brian and Jessica's lives crumble would give me the closure I needed. But as the months passed, I came to understand that closure didn't come from destroying someone else. It came from within, by accepting that life had changed and that the past couldn't be rewritten. In time, the anger I had clung to so tightly began to loosen its grip. I stopped replaying every memory, stopped picking apart the moments of our marriage to figure out where it had all gone wrong. Looking back didn't matter anymore. The answers weren't important. What mattered was the future and what I chose to do with it. As the months went on, Megan and I grew closer, our bond deepening in ways I hadn't expected. We didn't rush into anything. There was no need to. We both understood that healing takes time, and rebuilding trust can't be forced. But little by little, we started letting each other in. And for the first time in what felt like forever, I could finally breathe again. One evening, as we sat together on my apartment balcony, watching the sunset paint the sky over the city, I turned to her and asked, "Do you ever wonder what life would have been like if none of this had happened?" She glanced over at me, her eyes thoughtful, reflecting the fading light. Sometimes. But then I remind myself that we can't change the past. All we can do is learn from it. Yeah, I nodded, letting her words sink in. I guess you're right. She smiled softly, leaning her head against my shoulder. We're different now, Matthew. Stronger. Maybe a little more scarred, but definitely stronger. I sat with that thought for a while, letting it settle. We had both been through hell, each of us in our own way. But we had come out the other side, still standing, still moving forward. Maybe that's what healing really was, not erasing the pain, but figuring out how to live with it, scars and all. As the evening deepened and the stars began to peek through the darkness, I realized something important. I was ready for whatever came next. The revenge I had sought, it was necessary for me to move forward, but it wasn't the final chapter. It was just a piece of the story, one part of a life that was still unfolding. Jessica and Brian were out of the picture now, their lives reduced to ruins. But mine? Mine was still here, waiting to be rebuilt. And for the first time in a long while, I felt a sense of peace. Not because I had destroyed them, but because I had survived them. The past would always be a part of me, etched into the fabric of who I was, but it no longer held control over me. I had taken my power back, not through vengeance, but through the choice to move on, to let go, and to start anew. And as I sat there, with Megan beside me, the quiet hum of the city below us, I knew I was ready to step into that new chapter. For the first time in a long time, the future didn't feel uncertain or filled with doubt. It felt like a promise of something better, something worth moving toward. And I was ready to embrace it.